Get this woman out of here before she begs for a loan she'll never deserve." The words ripped through the marble-floored bank lobby, loud enough to freeze every hand mid-transaction. Heads turned. A silence fell, only broken by the echo of polished shoes clicking against the tiles as the branch manager strutted forward. His navy suit shimmered under the fluorescent lights, his golden cufflinks flashing like tiny beacons of arrogance. He didn't just speak the words, he performed them, one hand cutting through the air, the other tugging at his silk tie as though his position alone made him untouchable. The manager's eyes were cold, narrowed with superiority, the kind that had been honed over years of treating people like statistics on a spreadsheet. Customers were numbers. Faces didn't matter, except when skin color and background gave him an excuse to remind someone of their place. He straightened his posture, chest puffed out, enjoying the show of dominance in front of his employees. He gestured toward the door with a theatrical sweep, like a stage actor dismissing an extra from his play. The woman he targeted didn't flinch. She stood just inside the threshold, a folder clutched gently in her hands. Her black blazer was neatly pressed, her heels simple but elegant. Her calm presence clashed starkly with the venom aimed her way. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, chin lifted, eyes steady, as though the insult hadn't cut as deep as everyone assumed it would, and that composure only fueled the ridicule. A young teller behind the counter smirked nervously, trying to hide it behind his hand. Two customers near the velvet rope exchanged whispers. "Does she even have an account here?" Another snickered, pulling out a phone to record, eyes gleaming at the prospect of capturing humiliation for a few cheap likes. A ripple of laughter spread like wildfire, low and cruel, while others simply shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. The manager leaned in, lips curling into a smirk meant to pierce. "This is a place of business, not a charity," he declared, his voice dripping with condescension. He wanted the entire room to remember this moment. Him towering, her shrinking. At least that's how he imagined it, but the woman didn't shrink. She didn't move an inch. Her silence pressed against the noise, heavier than words, heavier than the arrogance that filled the air. In that stillness, something unspoken trembled, an authority not yet revealed, a storm waiting behind calm eyes. The crowd didn't know it, but the laughter they shared would be the last sound of superiority in that bank. The narrator's voice cuts in like a blade through glass. They thought they were shaming a powerless woman, but within minutes their laughter would turn into stunned silence, when the truth hit harder than any gavel. She hadn't arrived at that bank by accident, nor had her presence been a random act of chance. Her life up until that moment had been a long road paved with sacrifice, grit, and lessons carved deep into her heart. Raised by a single mother who juggled 2 jobs, she had grown up knowing that life rarely handed second chances. Her mornings began with the sound of her mother leaving before dawn to clean offices, and her evenings ended with the faint creak of the door when her mother came home from a late shift. Exhausted but still smiling, as a child, she would sit at the chipped wooden table, books spread wide while her mother's weary hands kneaded dough for the next day's bread. "Study hard, baby," her mother would whisper, "because your mind is the one thing they can't take from you." Those words became her shield. When the lights flickered because the bill was overdue, when classmates laughed at her second-hand clothes, when she walked past banks where polished men in suits seemed untouchable, she carried that whisper inside her. Through high school, she studied late into the night. College was no easier. She worked part-time jobs, waitressing, cleaning, tutoring, whatever it took to pay tuition and keep herself afloat. While others partied, she pored over financial textbooks with coffee-stained pages, her only luxury a small desk lamp that barely lit the room. Every small victory, a passed exam, a scholarship won, a professor's praise, was a brick in the foundation of the life she was determined to build. Sacrifices became her rhythm. She skipped meals to save money, wore the same pair of shoes until the soles wore thin, and said no to outings that would drain her budget. Yet she never allowed bitterness to seep into her heart. Those who knew her described her as disciplined, fair, and unshakable, qualities she had cultivated not through privilege but through endurance. There was one memory, though, that never left her. Sitting on her grandmother's porch one summer evening, she confessed her frustration. "It doesn't matter how hard I work. They'll still look at me and see less." Her grandmother, a woman whose back had bent under years of labor but whose eyes still held steel, leaned forward and said, "Respect isn't borrowed from banks. It's earned by how you treat people. Remember that. Money fades, titles fade, respect doesn't." Those words became a compass she carried into every room she entered. Her dream had always been quiet but firm, to build a financial institution where no one was judged by skin, accent, or background. A place where the single mother with calloused hands or the immigrant with broken English could walk in and be treated with dignity. She never bragged about it, never announced her plans loudly. She worked in silence, letting her results speak while others doubted her, mocked her, or tried to block her path. And yet, while she climbed in silence, the man who now sought to humiliate her had lived a very different life. The branch manager was a creature of appearances. He worshipped status, adored power, and thrived on belittling those he deemed unworthy. His office was a shrine to his ego. Glossy photographs of him shaking hands with board members, framed certificates angled just right to catch the eye, even a plaque boasting his years of service excellence. He wore his arrogance like cologne, strong enough to choke a room. To his staff, he constantly reminded them that he was the guardian of the bank's standards. Standards that had nothing to do with fairness or integrity, but everything to do with appearances, wealth, and skin color. He prided himself on being selective. In his mind, protecting the image of the bank meant gatekeeping it from those who didn't fit. Employees whispered about his cruelty when he wasn't around. Some feared him, others quietly despised him. But in public, he carried himself like a king. To deny service to a woman like her wasn't an accident. It was his favorite performance, the theater of arrogance played out for an audience of customers and staff, and that's why the moment inside the bank cut so deeply. He thought he was repeating an old routine, just another day of drawing laughter and nods from those too timid to oppose him. But this day was different. The woman he mocked wasn't just another customer. She wasn't someone who would fold under pressure or shrink under shame. She was a storm dressed in calm, a lesson waiting to unfold. She had been taught all her life, dignity doesn't shout, it waits. Then it roars. "You people always come here asking for things you can't afford." The manager's words cracked across the lobby like a lash, sharp enough to silence the clicking keyboards and the faint hum of the ceiling lights. He didn't whisper it to her quietly, as a man with dignity might have done. He said it for the room, for the audience, his voice raised deliberately so every customer, teller, and bystander could hear. He wanted humiliation to hang in the air. He wanted her to feel smaller than the marble tiles beneath her heels. With a theatrical wave of his hand, the manager dismissed her existence as though swatting away dust. He pivoted toward the glass doors, where a tall, silver-haired white man had just entered the bank. "Mr. Whitmore!" His tone transformed instantly, syrupy and eager, his face bright with the kind of smile he had never once shown to the woman still waiting patiently at the front of the line. "It's always such an honor. How can we serve you today?" The hypocrisy was blatant. Moments ago his voice was full of contempt. Now it rang with honey-dripped flattery. The crowd saw it too, and reactions split like a water meeting stone. A pair of women giggled behind manicured hands, nudging each other as if this cruelty were entertainment. A man by the ATM pulled out his phone and pressed record, whispering to a friend, "You don't see this every day." Others, however, shifted on their feet, unease creeping into their eyes. They weren't ready to step in, but something about the imbalance didn't sit right. At the center of it all stood the black woman, unmoved. She didn't drop her gaze. She didn't back away. Her hands stayed calmly folded over the simple folder she carried, the faint outline of papers visible beneath the cover. She looked out of place only in the sense that her composure belonged somewhere far greater than this bank. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was level and precise. "I'd like to conduct my business." She didn't raise her tone, but the firmness inside it carried across the room. The words unsettled the manager. He expected pleading, excuses, maybe even anger. He expected her to break beneath the weight of public embarrassment. Instead, her calm tone undercut him more powerfully than a scream. He raised his chin, sneered, and barked louder, determined to keep control. I said no. Do I need to repeat myself? This is a respectable institution, not some corner store where anyone can wander in. His gaze swept the lobby, checking to see who was nodding along, who was laughing with him, who was feeding his ego. The young teller at the far right counter froze mid-transaction, his hands fumbling with a stack of deposit slips. He'd seen his boss humiliate plenty of people before, but something about today felt different. The venom was thicker, the cruelty sharper. He glanced at the woman, saw how she stood so still, and for the first time in his short career, he felt ashamed of the uniform he wore. The room grew restless. Whispers rippled like waves. "Does she even have an account here?" One woman muttered, her tone mocking. "She looks out of place," another said with a smirk. A man in a suit snorted, "Probably here to beg for a handout." But mixed among the ridicule were quieter voices, almost drowned out by the laughter. "This doesn't seem right," a mother murmured to her teenage son, who shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his hoodie. "She hasn't even raised her voice." The manager puffed himself up taller, emboldened by the whispers that sided with him. He gestured grandly toward Whitmore, who stood bemused near the counter. "Do you know who this man is?" The manager announced, his words echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "This is the kind of client we welcome. Men who build futures, men who represent the excellence of this institution. Not people who drag us backward." Each syllable landed like a stone. His words weren't just aimed at her. They were a sweeping condemnation of every customer who looked like her, every dreamer who didn't fit into his narrow vision of worthiness. He believed the room was his stage, the customers his audience, and he the hero of a performance in which she would play the fool. But still, she didn't move. She didn't fold. She stood steady, her expression calm, her silence growing heavier with every second. That silence unnerved him more than anything. It unsettled the customers too. Laughter began to falter. Smiles froze on lips. The dignity in her restraint was beginning to cast shadows over his arrogance. The phones kept recording. Red dots blinked on tiny screens. This was no longer just a performance for a lobby. This was becoming a performance for the world. And though he didn't realize it, the star of the scene was no longer him. Whitmore, still standing nearby, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice cautious. The manager straightened immediately, eager to maintain his image. "No issue at all, sir," he said quickly. "Just keeping standards intact." He said it loudly for the room to hear, as if those words could justify every ounce of cruelty. The woman adjusted her grip on her folder. Her eyes didn't waver. "I only asked to be served," she said simply, her words as clean and steady as a drawn line of ink. The teller, who had been fidgeting, finally spoke, his voice small but audible. "Sir, maybe we should—" He stopped when the manager shot him a glare so sharp it could slice glass. The young man dropped his gaze, his courage snuffed out before it could fully spark. A man near the back of the line leaned close to his companion. His voice was low, meant only for one set of ears, but in the tense silence it carried farther than intended. "Careful," he whispered, "sometimes the quiet ones surprise you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Some customers nodded subtly, recognizing the truth in them. Others grew even more uneasy, shifting and coughing as if waiting for something they couldn't quite name. The manager laughed, brittle and forced. He didn't like the change in the room. He didn't like the way her silence seemed to pull gravity toward her, away from him. He raised his voice again, desperate to seize back the spotlight. "Enough of this nonsense. You're wasting everyone's time. Leave before I have security escort you out." But even as he barked, his tone cracked. For the first time, his voice betrayed something he didn't want the world to see: uncertainty. And still she stood, silent, calm, unshaken. The balance of power was shifting, though few realized it yet. The humiliation that had begun so confidently was unraveling, thread by thread. In the face of composure he couldn't break. And as the seconds stretched, the crowd waited, sensing the moment was far from over. "I said leave before I call security. This bank is not for you." The manager's roar shattered the heavy silence. His face flushed crimson, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. His voice, once brimming with confidence, now carried a ragged edge of desperation. He jabbed a finger toward the door like an executioner delivering a final sentence. The staff froze in place, their hands hovering over keyboards, eyes darting nervously between the woman and their manager. Every single one of them expected her to wilt, to bow her head and walk out in shame. That was the routine. That was how it always ended. But she didn't move. She didn't even blink. Instead, she lowered her gaze briefly to the folder in her hands, sliding it open with deliberate calm. The hush in the room thickened as paper brushed against paper. When she lifted her eyes again, her voice was steady, clear, and devastating in its composure. "You've made a mistake," she said simply. She drew out a single document and laid it on the counter. The bank's embossed seal shimmered under the fluorescent lights. Another sheet followed, then another, until a neat stack of official papers sat before her like the quiet weight of destiny. The manager's smirk faltered. He leaned forward, trying to peer at the documents without appearing too curious. "What is this supposed to be?" He scoffed, though his voice cracked ever so slightly. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. "This morning," she said, her words deliberate, "the acquisition of this bank was finalized. As of today, I am the majority shareholder." For a heartbeat, the room was paralyzed. Then the sound of gasps broke like a wave across the lobby. Phones shot higher into the air, screens glowing as the world beyond those walls was invited in. Every customer, every teller, every bystander now had evidence of the moment arrogance shattered. The manager's face was drained of color. His mouth opened and closed uselessly, searching for denial, for a way to claw back control. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "Impossible. You think you can walk in here and—" His words choked off when one of the younger clerks stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, I can verify this." His hands shook as he took the documents, eyes widening as he skimmed the first page. "Her name is right here. It's true." The crowd buzzed louder, disbelief blending with awe. The manager lunged for the papers, but the clerk turned his back, shielding them. "We need to call the board immediately," the clerk said firmly, his fear evaporating in the face of truth. Within minutes, a speakerphone call connected to an investor was placed. The line crackled before a crisp voice confirmed it. "Yes, effective as of 8 a.m. today, she owns controlling interest in your branch and all subsidiaries attached. She is, in fact, your new superior." The words detonated in the room. Gasps turned into outright shouts of disbelief. A woman near the line clapped her hand over her mouth. The man who had whispered earlier about the quiet ones now grinned, muttering, "I told you." The manager stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out. The arrogance that had dripped from every word now dissolved into raw panic. His eyes darted wildly, searching for allies among his staff, but every face he met was pale, ashamed, or openly furious. His kingdom of intimidation had collapsed in an instant. She gathered the papers calmly, tucking them neatly back into the folder as if the revelation hadn't just shifted the axis of the room. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the man who had mocked her minutes earlier. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, each step like a gavel striking. When she spoke again, her tone carried the weight of every lesson her mother and grandmother had taught her, sharpened into a blade of truth. "Respect," she said, her voice calm but thunderous, "is the only currency that never loses its value." The line cut through the air like lightning. Customers erupted into applause, some cheering, others clapping so hard the sound echoed against the vaulted ceiling. Phones tilted and zoomed, recording every second as if the moment itself were history being written. The manager looked cornered, sweat dripping down his temple, his mouth opening as though to beg, but no words came. He was stripped bare, exposed, a man revealed as small beneath the mountain of his arrogance. She didn't let the silence linger long. Her voice rose again, steady and resolute, carrying finality like a judge delivering sentence. "You're fired," she declared, "and so is every staff member who stood by your mockery." The words dropped like a hammer, silencing the room instantly. Tellers froze, their faces blanching, whispers breaking out among the staff as they realized what had just been pronounced. A few immediately pleaded, "Please, I didn't laugh," but their protests were drowned out by the weight of her decree. The manager staggered, his arrogance fully drained, his body trembling with the collapse of everything he thought he owned. For once, he had no words. The applause swelled again, louder this time, filling the lobby like thunder. And in that moment, the woman who had walked in with nothing but a folder walked out carrying something far greater, the full measure of respect she had always deserved. The moment her words fell, "You're fired." And so is every staff member who stood by your mockery. The bank lobby erupted into chaos. The manager staggered backward like a man stripped of his crown, his hands trembling, his lips moving in soundless protest. The staff he had once commanded so confidently now scattered, scrambling to salvage their positions. Some pleaded openly. "Please, I didn't laugh," one teller stammered, her voice desperate. Another clutched at the edge of the counter. "I was only following his lead. Please don't let me lose my job." But the silence of their complicity had already been judged. Their frantic begging only made the reversal more humiliating. They had enjoyed the show when she was on the receiving end. Now the spotlight turned mercilessly on them. Customers raised their phones higher, recording every second with giddy energy. The scene was no longer confined to marble floors and glass walls. Within seconds, clips began to stream online, uploaded to social media with captions like, "Bank manager gets what he deserves," and "She owned the whole bank." Notifications pinged, timelines flooded, and comments exploded before she even closed her folder. By the time she walked toward the center of the room, the story had already started to spread across the city. People who had never stepped foot in that branch were already watching, their jaws dropping as they replayed the moment the manager's arrogance crumbled. Among the crowd stood a tall man in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable until he stepped forward and began to clap slowly. The room hushed. His face was familiar. One of the city's most well-known investors, a man whose name was attached to several Fortune 500 companies. He looked at her not with pity or politeness, but with genuine respect. "You've just shown this institution what leadership looks like," he said, his voice carrying authority that silenced the frantic staff. "If you ever decide to expand your vision, I'd be honored to support it. People like you don't just change banks. They change systems." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. In that instant, her dream, the one she had carried silently through years of sacrifice, was no longer invisible. Doors that had once seemed sealed shut now stood wide open. But before she answered him, before she even acknowledged the investor's offer, she pulled out her phone and stepped aside. The applause dimmed as she dialed a number and pressed it to her ear. Her mother answered after 2 rings, her voice warm but tired. "Baby, are you all right? You sound out of breath." The woman smiled softly, tears threatening her composure for the first time that day. "Mama," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I did it. The bank, our bank, it's mine now." On the other end, there was silence, then a trembling inhale. Her mother's voice broke when she spoke again. "Baby, you didn't just walk into a bank today. You walked into history." The words settled over her like a blessing, heavier and more powerful than all the applause combined. For years, she had carried her mother's sacrifices in silence. Now, she had given her something back, proof that every long night and every whispered encouragement had not been in vain. Meanwhile, the former manager slumped in a chair, head buried in his hands. The very staff that once looked up to him now avoided his gaze, unwilling to share in his downfall. The audience he had performed for just minutes earlier no longer admired him. They documented his disgrace for the world to consume. Within an hour, local media outlets picked up the story. Notifications buzzed across phones. Breaking news: bank manager fired by black woman. He tried to humiliate. A photo from the lobby, mid-applause, spread across headlines. On television screens, anchors repeated the words with relish, describing the moment arrogance met justice in the most public way possible. She didn't revel in the coverage. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. She walked out of the bank with her head high, the folder tucked neatly under her arm, and a city buzzing behind her. Some followed her to the door, clapping, offering congratulations. Others simply stood in stunned silence, knowing they had witnessed something unforgettable. The balance of power had shifted so completely that even the marble pillars seemed to echo differently as she exited. She hadn't just flipped a story. She had rewritten it entirely. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the polished walls of that single branch. What had begun as a confrontation in front of a few customers quickly became a global headline. The video of her calm revelation, papers laid neatly on the counter while the arrogant manager's smirk dissolved, was replayed millions of times. News anchors dissected it, bloggers praised it, and ordinary people shared it as proof that dignity could topple even the loudest arrogance. She did not waste the moment. Rather than bask in fleeting fame, she channeled it into something lasting. Within a month, she launched a financial literacy foundation aimed at marginalized communities. Its mission was simple: to make sure no one was denied an opportunity because of prejudice, ignorance, or intimidation. Free workshops were held in churches, schools, and community centers. Programs were created to teach families how to save, invest, and build credit without fear of ridicule. Her foundation became a beacon for those who had long felt locked out of the financial world. Young people who had once hesitated to step foot inside banks now found mentors who looked like them, spoke their language, and treated them with respect. For the first time, people who had been invisible were not only seen, they were empowered. Meanwhile, the former manager's name became a cautionary tale. His reputation was in ruins, shredded not only by his actions but by the merciless replay of his own words. Clips of him sneering, "This bank is not for you," became viral memes, captions stamped beneath his photo as a reminder of arrogance brought low. He could no longer find work in finance. Doors that once opened eagerly now slammed shut. To the public, he was no longer a respected manager. He was infamous as the manager who mocked the owner. Inside the bank itself, sweeping reforms followed. Her leadership brought immediate change. A bold new policy was introduced across all branches: zero tolerance for discrimination. Any staff member caught humiliating or profiling clients would be dismissed on the spot. Diversity and inclusivity training became mandatory. Hiring practices were rewritten, ensuring that leadership reflected the communities they served. The cultural shift was profound. Clients who had once entered nervously now walked in with confidence. Employees who had feared speaking up against unfairness found themselves empowered by a system that finally listened. Slowly, the bank transformed from a symbol of exclusion into a standard-bearer of fairness. Online, the impact reached even further. Hashtags like "Your respect is currency" and "She owns the bank" trended worldwide. Millions posted their own stories of discrimination, drawing courage from her composure. Activists praised her as proof that change could begin in a single room and ripple outward. Parents showed their children the video as a lesson: stand tall, stay calm, and let dignity speak louder than arrogance. What resonated most wasn't the paperwork she revealed, or even the power she wielded. It was the way she carried herself in those crucial moments. Silent, steady, unshaken. In a world addicted to noise, her calm had been revolutionary. Months later, when she stood at a podium to announce her foundation's first nationwide initiative, the applause that filled the hall wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been silenced, every dream dismissed, every quiet voice that had been told, "You don't belong here." Her story had proven that belonging isn't granted by gatekeepers. It is claimed by those who refuse to be denied. Her grandmother's words lived on in the policies, the programs, and the movement she had sparked. Respect isn't borrowed from banks. It's earned by how you treat people. And so, her legacy was not only a bank she controlled, but a world she helped reshape. One where dignity, once denied, became the most valuable currency of all. They mocked her, thinking respect was something written in bank accounts. But in one unforgettable moment, arrogance collapsed, and her dignity rewrote the rules. What began as a cruel attempt to humiliate her became the turning point for an entire institution, a reminder that true power is never measured in suits, titles, or the weight of a balance sheet. It is measured in how one treats others when no cameras are rolling, when applause has not yet begun. Her silence that day was not a weakness. It was strength restrained, the kind of strength that waits for the right moment to roar. When it did, the world listened. Power and wealth mean nothing without respect. And silence, patience, and dignity can be sharper than any sword, cutting deeper than arrogance ever imagined. Her story is more than a viral clip. It is a call to action, for institutions to change, for individuals to stand taller, and for us all to remember that respect is the only currency that never loses its value. What would you have done if you were in that bank? Comment below and share this story if you believe respect should never be denied.